this week's topic is in regards to food safety. So some of the things we're going to focus on is what they mean by food safety, and it's not just microbial, not just biological, but there'll be other agents in the food that can make it poisonous. And that's where we're going to look at the hazards. So hazards in food could be, it's mainly microbial, mainly biological, could also be chemical hazards and physical hazards. An example of a chemical hazard is a food allergen, so we're going to have a look at those as well. And we're going to have a look at some suggested mechanisms of controlling the food safety hazards. In particular, we're going to look at the World Health Organization. They've come up with this program of 5 keys. Now, if we go back to the Australian Dietary Guidelines, in guideline number 5, they really focus on the need to make sure that the food is actually safe. So they talk about making sure it's not cross-contaminated and that it's been cooked and stored correctly. Video from KFC. What I'll do, I'll make sure that I've got the YouTube link and you guys can have a look at it later on. But there was a salmonella outbreak at one of the KFC branches and resulted in a young girl suffering permanent brain damage as a result of that food poisoning. There's another one, Garibaldi. This is South Australia. It happened in South Australia. This one here had some E. coli in some small goods. In this case, a small girl died, and there's about 20 odd people that suffered permanent internal organ damage. Again, I'll see if I find the YouTube link and put it up there on Canvas. This one happened not too long ago. This one is United States. They had salmonella contaminating peanut butter. And because the CEO didn't have food safety programs in place, he actually received 28 years jail for that one. All right, so back to our food and the link between food and food safety. The first thing to point out is that food is not naturally, it's not inherently safe. The food itself has got nutrients, it's got water. So just as we as humans use the food as nutrients, if the food then becomes contaminated with bacteria, then those bacteria can grow, and then those bacteria can cause hazards. So sometimes it can cause a minor hazard, in causing you diarrhea and vomiting, but sometimes these things can lead to permanent damage and death. Now, the food industry is well aware of problems with the food, and they have put in place all sorts of systems to make sure the food is actually safe. And there's also a whole lot of legal requirements that the food industry must meet. Right, so when we're talking about food illness, we're talking about a person becoming ill as a result of consuming some food, and they can become ill through one of these 3 hazards. It's either a biological hazard, chemical hazard, or a physical hazard. And then as a consequence of consuming food that's contaminated, the symptoms might be relatively mild. When I say mild, it might be vomiting, diarrhea, or it can be very serious. The bacteria can spread from your intestines through your bloodstream, cause septicemia, cause meningitis, and people can actually die. Yell out if you've got questions or comments as we're going along. So this graph here is just showing us where major food poisonings actually happen. And you can see a lot of them happen in your own home, 15%. About 40% happen in retail, so there'd be restaurants, takeaway shops. And the other 40% over here, where they say other, this is where they haven't worked it out, because you're consuming meals at different places, and sometimes they can't work out what was the source of the contamination. So a significant number is happening at home, significant numbers happening at restaurants. And the types of hazards, it's mainly bacterial or biological, so that's 90%, some chemical, and some physical. Physical ones aren't listed here properly. So Codex, listing Codex is the international standards on food safety. There's 168 member countries, and they define food safety. Food safety hazard as anything that can cause harm to the consumer. So it could be biological, chemical, physical. We'll have a look at some examples. So the biological, mainly bacterial, could be viruses. Chemical hazards, anything that cross-contaminates into the food. It's often could be a sanitizer that's used in the kitchen, and that can actually end up accidentally into the food, or any other physical object. Here's some examples of biological hazard. They call it biological rather than just microbial because it could be bacteria, it could be viruses, and it could be pathogens such as protozoa, for example. So it's not just bacteria. But here's some of the major ones. I'm sure you've come across E. coli before, Salmonella, Staphylococcus, this one at the bottom, Clostridiums. So these are some typical organisms that have caused food poisonings in the past. Here's an example of a chemical hazard. So from memory, this one happened in Spain. Yep, Spain. So the guy went to the restaurant, ordered some wine, and he was actually served up some dishwashing liquid instead of the white wine. Yeah, he must have gulped it down because he didn't notice the taste. And as a result of consuming this dishwashing liquid, the person actually ended up dying. It's another chemical hazard. This little boy again went to a restaurant, I think it was, and I think it was after he ordered some lemonade, and somebody had incorrectly stored some caustic soda in a lemonade bottle. It was served to the little boy, and he suffered burns to the inside of his esophagus. This one's actually taken from Coles Supermarket. These are all the different physical hazards that Coles has found in a variety of different foods. So all of these can cause harm to the consumer. So now some of the reasons why the food has become poisonous. This is in regards to, say, biological hazards. So for bacteria to grow, obviously it needs to become contaminated. So it might be contaminated by cross-contamination from an infected person, for example, down here, or cross-contamination from raw food. So raw meat, for example, might contain Listeria, Salmonella, E. coli. So firstly, the food needs to become contaminated, and then the bacteria needs to then grow in the food. So if the food is not properly cooked, so it doesn't get to the right temperature, and right temperature needs to be above 70 degrees. So if the food's not cooked properly, bacteria can actually start growing in there. Likewise, if it's not cooled properly, the bacteria can still keep growing. This is from FSANZ, Food Safety Australia New Zealand, from their website. So this is some of the statistics that they have given us. So they're estimating they've got about 4 million cases of biological or microbial food poisoning every year in Australia. And of those, 600 result in death. Now, it's not normally the death of healthy adults. It's often the death of somebody who's already suffering something else. So they might already be suffering from cancer or something else. And then on top of that, if they get a food that's infected with a biological agent, they could actually end up dying, costing Australia something like $2.6 billion every year. So these are the people that are most high risk. So why do you think these people will be classified as high risk? So we've got the very young, the elderly, people who are sick. So why are these people more prone to an infection such as a food poisoning infection? Okay, very good. Someone said low immune system. Exactly. So all these people have got a suppressed immune system, either as a child, the immune system hasn't quite developed. As you get older, your immune system doesn't work quite as well. And obviously, if you're sick, your immune system is down. So all of these people are high risk. All right, so just looking at the numbers, so from PASANS, they said that every year in Australia we get about 4 million cases of food poisoning. So if you think about, well, that works out to 11,000 per day. And if you think about how many meals are served in Australia every day, it works out about 20 billion. So your chances of getting food poisoning on any particular day is 0.02%. So it's pretty low, but when it does happen, as we see, sometimes it can actually result in death. So some of these are some of the big ones we had in Australia. I mentioned the Garibaldi one. Yep, so we had a little girl that died, and there's more than 20. I thought there's only about 20, but there's over 40 people have suffered internal organ damage as a result of this poisonous food. There was a big one in Kraft, affecting 2,300 people. Nobody died. Quite a few got sick. And in Japan, there's a really big one. They had 12,000 people got sick. So even in fancy restaurants, you can end up with food poisoning if people don't follow the correct procedures. So there's a high-end Melbourne restaurant, the Langham Hotel, and they had food poisoning as a result of contaminated mayonnaise. Oh, there's that link to the KFC. So there's the YouTube link. Now, food does become contaminated quite regularly. So even the commercial producers of food, if you look at the PASANS website, so there's a website which lists all the current product recalls. And if you went there right now, if you followed that link, you'd find that every couple of weeks there's food that's been recalled, either because it's unsafe because it contains a biological hazard, or it might be unsafe because it contains a physical hazard, such as this one here containing some plastic, or it might be containing some sort of chemical hazard. So this here has got a chemical allergen in that it contains peanuts. And here's another one, another biological hazard. This one's containing the pathogen Listeria. Okay, you might have noticed product recalls in the past. These you might find in the newspapers. So if you look at the Age or the Sun, Herald Sun, every week you'd find some sort of product recall notice. You'll also find these on the entrance to a supermarket. So these are a legal requirement that if the food does become contaminated with either a biological, chemical or physical hazard in Australia, it's a legal requirement that the manufacturers notify the public using this standard format. Here are some foods that are classified as high risk. Any guesses as to why some of these foods are classified as high risk? No guesses? Well, a couple of things. One, these foods are very high in nutrients. So once they become contaminated, the bacteria grow quite happily in them. They also have fairly high moisture content, and they've got a fairly neutral pH. So they've basically got all the requirements for microbial growth. So once they become contaminated, the bacteria will grow in these foods quite quickly. So some of the things you can do either at home or in a restaurant to make food less prone for microbial food poisoning. Well, we can have a look. If the food's got high water, it's going to be more likely to be spoiled, more likely to have food poisoning. If the food is high in nutrients, such as protein, again, it's more likely that bacteria are going to grow. You can add preservatives. So if the food contains preservatives such as salt and sugar, that'll actually mean that the bacteria can't grow. It changes the osmotic pressure, so preventing the bacteria from growing. And also if we can lower the pH, we can get the pH lower than say 4.5, which was similar pH to a yogurt, it would actually make the product less susceptible to food poisoning. Bacteria may come from the food itself. So sometimes the raw food, so whether it's raw meat, raw seafood, raw eggs might naturally contain bacteria, or sometimes it's coming from cross-contamination. So people are often carriers of various bacteria. So on your hands, you could be carrying all sorts of things, depending on what you've done. If you've gone to the toilet, if you've handled some rubbish, or if you've handled some raw food, you could be carrying all sorts of different microbes on your hands. The food can also become poisonous in that it contains natural toxins. So we know about poisonous mushrooms, we know about poisonous shellfish and poisonous fish, and there's also poisonous vegetables, things like green potatoes that contain a natural toxin. Here's some people that became quite sick from eating mushrooms which were poisonous. In terms of people getting sick from food, often people are allergic to various foods. In Australia, these are the 8 food groups that are classified as allergens. Now, these don't cover all allergens. There's hundreds and hundreds of different foods that people are allergic to, but these cover about 95% of all food allergens. So by law, if your food contains any of these allergens, you must record it on the product. So if you're a food manufacturer selling a food, on the label, you must notify the consumer if a food contains one of these allergens. Okay, again, symptoms can be pretty mild, so you might get some rash, or it can be very severe. You get significant swelling, and enough swelling that will block the airway, and the person can actually stop breathing, or can enter what's called anaphylactic shock, where the whole body shuts down and the person can actually die. Not sure if any of you guys have got any food allergies. Anyone in this group? No? There's a video on food allergies. Again, I'll find the YouTube link and you can watch this one later on. So we quickly mentioned the bacteria can enter the food because of cross-contamination, particularly from raw food or from people having dirty hands. So that covers the cross-contamination and personal hygiene. It can also come from the environment if we don't clean the equipment and the environment. It can also come from incorrect temperature control. So either the temperature is not hot enough or not cold enough. So we saw this chart before. Not sure why that slide's there. Okay, now we can look at how we can prevent these food poisoning agents from contaminating our food, and we can follow the World Health Organization recommendations. So they've come up with this system, what they call the 5 keys. So within the 5 keys, they talk about number 1, making sure you're keeping everything clean. Number 2, making sure you've got preventing cross-contamination by separating your raw food from your cooked food. Number 3, they talk about making sure the food is thoroughly cooked, so above 70 degrees. Making sure the food is stored correctly, so less than 5 degrees, and make sure you're starting off with good quality materials and good quality water. So they give us some background in terms of the problem. We've got hundreds and hundreds of diseases that can be transmitted through the food. So they prepared this food manual. Again, a little video, which you can look at later on. Okay, number 1 was making sure you keep everything clean. And it starts off with making sure your own hands are clean and making sure that all equipment that's used at home in the kitchen, that is clean as well. Why? Because we don't want to have cross-contamination. You don't want to be introducing bacteria from your hands or from equipment or utensils into your food. So in terms of cleaning, so just normal cleaning with soap and water will actually physically remove the bacteria from your hands. Doesn't necessarily kill them. If you want to actually kill them, you'd actually need to use a hand sanitizer. But most of the time, it's just sufficient to just simply do hand washing, because all we want to do is actually remove the bacteria. So we saw that previously. All sorts of different bacteria could be on your hands. Oh, go back. So just a reminder, your hands and dirty equipment can kill all sorts of different bacteria. So it's very important to remove those bacteria by proper hand washing and by proper cleaning of your equipment and your utensils. So before you prepare your food, you must ensure that you've followed good hygiene, you've washed your hands, and you've cleaned and sanitized your equipment. I think by now we should all know the correct way of washing our hands. Washing for at least 20 seconds. Use nice warm water. Use a good scrubbing action to make sure you get into all the nooks and crannies on your hands to physically remove the bacteria from your hands. So anytime you think your hands have got dirty, so whether you've gone to the toilet or whether you've touched something that's dirty, rubbish bin, whatever it might be, playing with animals, you need to then wash your hands. Anytime your hands get contaminated, you need to re-wash the hands. This is from the Victorian government, the hand washing procedure. So again, similarly, you need to make sure you do it for at least 20 seconds. Okay, next point was to make sure we don't cross-contaminate from the raw food to the cooked food. So we know that raw food, whether it's raw red meat, chicken, seafood, naturally contains bacteria. So the bacteria that might have been in the intestines of the animal, as the animal gets slaughtered, then the bacteria contaminate the rest of the product. So it will have, chicken, for example, will have all sorts of things. It'll have Campylobacter, it'll have Salmonella, it'll have E. coli. And they estimate that like 30% of all chickens will contain Salmonella, E. coli, and so on. So you need to make sure that you're not spreading the bacteria that are in that naturally in that raw food to other parts of your kitchen. So that's where they talk about make sure you're using separate equipment. So it might be separate cutting boards, separate knives. So we don't want to transfer the bacteria that are in that raw food to other products. All right, so we're going to prevent cross-contamination. So how can you do it? Well, you can either have separate equipment, separate chopping board, or actually then if you haven't got two sets, we need to thoroughly wash the chopping board and the knives and other equipment after you've used the raw meats to make sure you don't contaminate the other food that you're going to be preparing. So here, the best way is you've got two chopping boards, two sets of knives. If not, do the vegetables first and then do the raw meat after that. Okay, number 3 is to make sure you cook the food thoroughly. So even though the raw food might contain dangerous bacteria, so whether it might be E. coli or salmonella or whatever it might be in there, once we get to 70 degrees, actually kill that bacteria. So it kills the bacteria because if you remember the bacteria, it's just a bacterial cell. It's got a cell membrane. Membrane's made up of lipids and proteins. If I apply heat to lipids and proteins, I'll melt the lipids, I'll coagulate the proteins. Once the membrane stops working, the bacterial cells will actually die. So 70 degrees is more than enough to kill off the bacteria, whether it's E. coli, salmonella, staphylococcus, whatever it might be. So what we're doing for is aiming for at least 70 degrees. Here they're mentioning the difference between a steak, which you can eat rare, versus a hamburger or a mince, which you can't eat rare. So why do you think we can eat a rare steak, but you can't eat a rare hamburger? Does anybody have their meat rare? Or medium rare? All right, so I've got a couple of people that had it rare. That's good. So with a piece of steak, because it's come from the muscle of the animal, the muscle is normally sterile. So the only place where it might contain bacteria is as you cut it would be on the outside of the steak. So as long as I cook both sides of the steak, and it can be as for as little as a couple of minutes on each side or 1 minute on each side, that'll easily get it to 70 degrees on the surface of the meat. And I've killed off any bacteria that might be on the surface. Inside the meat, it should already be sterile anyway, so that's fine. But I can't have a rare hamburger because what I've done is chopped up the meat, and as I've chopped up the meat, I've then distributed any bacteria that might be there, not just in the surface of the hamburger, but throughout the whole hamburger. So with a hamburger, I must make sure that's thoroughly cooked all the way through. I can't have a rare hamburger. All right, so as long as we get to 70 degrees, we can be confident that we're killing off these disease-causing bacteria. So ideally use a thermometer. If you haven't got a thermometer, you can just make sure that the juices are running clear. So whether it's a hamburger or whether it's piece of chicken, you're looking to see that it's reached the right temperature. So you can judge whether they got 70 degrees either by using a thermometer or by looking at the colour of the food. Make sure you haven't got any pink colour there that indicating that the food is still raw. Okay, number 4. Okay. So these are rules about keeping food outside of the danger zone. Anyone heard about the danger zone before for food? No. So danger zone, they say anything between 5 degrees and 60 degrees is the danger zone. So you can't keep food in that danger zone because in that zone is where bacteria will keep growing. So we just saw the previous one said, look, as long as I get it above 70, I'll kill off those bacteria. So above 60, 70, you're stopping the bacteria from growing that way. If I make it really cold, the bacteria become dormant. They're not actually killed, but if I can keep it less than 5, at least they can't grow. So within that danger zone, between 5 and 60 degrees, bacteria will keep growing. And if they keep growing, that means they're more likely to cause infection, more likely to release toxins into the food, which makes the food poisonous. If I make the temperature less than 5, I'm not killing it, but I'm stopping it from growing. And we saw once we go above 60, particularly above 70, we actually start killing the bacteria. So the whole idea is to make sure the bacteria can't grow, either by making sure it's too cold or making sure it's too hot. So we can see here's the danger zone. Less than 5, bacteria are still alive, but they can't grow. Above 60, particularly above 70, the bacteria actually gets destroyed by the high temperature. All right, so here's some general rules about temperature. Cool it as fast as you can. Store it at less than 5 degrees. And ideally store it within, it needs to be cooled to 5 degrees within 2 hours to stop the bacteria from growing. Last one here is about making sure the materials you started off with, whether it's the raw materials, so it could be vegetables, meat, whatever you're using as raw materials, and also the water supply is of high quality. So remember, this is World Health Organization, so some countries don't have good quality water, for example. If I start off with very poor quality materials, poor quality water, it might have a very high level of bacteria and may have already produced toxins, and it then might become very difficult to remove those toxins or remove the number of bacteria, even following the other requirements of heating up to 70 degrees and so on. So they're suggesting here we need to start off with very good quality water and very good quality ingredients. So here they're talking about the preformed toxins. So if the bacteria get to high levels in the food or the water, they could already release toxins into that food, into that water. And some of those toxins are heat stable. So even though I might heat it up to 70 degrees, I can't get rid of these nasty toxins. So again, this is World Health Organization. So in some countries they're using rainwater or water from rivers. So for us, it's more about this part here, about making sure the ingredients are good quality, washing the fruits and vegetables. All right, so think about the materials that you're using and whether they're a reasonable quality or whether they might already be contaminated with dangerous bacteria and dangerous toxins. All right, so again, just talking about good quality water, good quality raw material. All right, and so just summing up, by following correct procedures, either by the procedures outlined in the Australian Dietary Guidelines, number 5, that they talk about caring for your food, preparing and storing it correctly, and or following the 5 recommendations from World Health Organization, can actually prevent these hazards from actually developing in the food, particularly those biological hazards, the microbial hazards from growing. And they are the main points I wanted to cover. At some stage, when you get time, if you could go back and have a look at those videos, the links will be available for you on Canvas. Okay, so before we log off, were there any questions that you wanted to ask, either about this